All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily DiGiovanni, and I work with CTO on the Research Ready program. Welcome to this month's Mentor Spotlight session. All right, so for those of you who are less familiar with Research Ready, you can find more information on the CTO website. The Mentor Spotlight series is a monthly webinar series where an expert on a particular topic shares best practices and highlights exceptional processes relevant to the research community in Ontario and Canada. We aim to be interactive in the sessions, but we also make this available online on demand at the link below. We also have a certificate of attendance for anyone that's here today live. We just ask you to complete a very short survey that will pop up at the end of the session, and this will allow us to create the certificate for those who are collecting continuing education credits. We're also looking for any feedback you have or topics you'd like to see, and we welcome that feedback regardless of the certificate. In terms of housekeeping, there will be some time at the end of the presentation for questions, so feel free to ask them in the chat or raise your hand and we can address them. All right, so today we'd like to welcome Megan Reilly, who will be sharing her expertise with us. Megan earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from Queen's University in 2008. In 2009, she began her career in hospital administration at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute in the Department of Finance and Administration. During her time in this role, she worked closely with research administration in many areas and gained an appreciation for the research being conducted at the Institute. Megan joined the Clinical Research and Compliance Office in April 2018 as the Compliance Officer. Her primary role is to support clinical research staff and clinical researchers in navigating the complex regulations, guidelines, and policies governing the conduct of clinical research to ensure study compliance. Megan earned her Research Administration Certificate in the summer of 2020. So now I'll pass it over to Megan.
So much. We practiced this before, Emily, but you know I'm going to mess it up. So give me 1 second here. Okay. Okay.
That's perfect.
Excellent. Okay, I feel like I should get a gold star from sharing my screen properly today. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I think I'm being oversold as an expert, but hopefully you will find this presentation interesting and informative. So as Emily said, my name is Megan. I work at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. I've worked there for about 13 years, and I've worked in research administration for about the last 5. And so today I'm going to be talking to you about how my institution implemented an e-regulatory binder system to manage our study's regulatory documents. So I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. So I wanted to start off by giving a little bit of background about my institution, just to give you some context. The University of Ottawa Heart Institute, or we call it UOHI for short, is located in Ottawa, Ontario, and we are Canada's largest heart health center dedicated to understanding, treating, and preventing heart disease. And at the Heart Institute, research and clinical care are very closely integrated, and something that we take a lot of pride in is the fact that our research and our clinical care really go hand in hand. So in terms of our clinical research activity, we have approximately 70 clinicians involved in research, either as PIs or as co-Is, and about 50 dedicated clinical research staff. We have approximately 350 clinical research studies ongoing at any time. So we are an active institution in terms of our clinical research. So I'm sure many of you know, having an active clinical research program comes the challenge of managing a large volume of essential study documents. So investigators and their study teams are required to maintain study documents in accordance with so many applicable legislation, regulations, guidelines, policies, procedures, etc., with lengthy storage periods being required in most circumstances. I think all of us did a happy dance when Health Canada announced that we could keep our Health Canada regulated study documents for 15 years instead of 25 years. But 15 years is still a long time. So, you know, managing these essential documents for lengthy periods of time can be a challenge. And then additionally, documents must be readily accessible for purposes of auditing and monitoring by various parties. So you really have to have a good system in place for managing these documents. So in 2018, our office wanted to understand the biggest challenges that teams were facing in terms of essential document management. So we sort of did a few focus groups. We reached out to our clinical research staff, and this is sort of the top 5 feedback items we got back from them. So first off, it was identified that it's really burdensome for staff to collect common documents such as CVs, licenses, training certificates, preventative maintenance records for shared equipment. And in doing so, it often resulted in them multiple staff going to the same people for the same documents. So it was burdensome on both sides. It was burdensome for the clinical research staff to collect them, but then it was also burdensome on the people who were having to hand over those documents. The second thing was, while our office provided a sample sort of table of contents of what should be in your regulatory binder for each of your studies, we as an institute didn't have a formal structure that we mandated be used, which meant that there was a lot of inconsistency between how teams were managing and organizing their essential documents. The third thing was that without an electronic format for regulatory binders, it was difficult to remotely monitor any external sites we had for our institute sponsored studies, multi-center studies. So, you know, keeping track of making sure that they were managing their essential documents properly was quite difficult. And then in terms of long-term storage costs, it can be very expensive to maintain essential documents for these lengthy storage periods, especially when you're having to send them off site. And our senior management felt very strongly that we needed to encourage staff to stop producing paper records as much as possible and try to rely more on electronic records where we could. And then the fifth thing was actually came from our office as opposed to the clinical research staff, but it was extremely burdensome for our office to keep track of training and credentials for our investigators and for our staff. So, you know, it was our responsibility to follow up with our staff and our investigators to remind them your GCP training is expiring or your CV needs to be updated. We were tracking it all manually in an Excel spreadsheet, and it was extremely difficult to maintain and keep up with. So after we received this feedback from the staff, our office began exploring options. You know, what can we put in place so that we can do a better job of managing essential documents? So we did some research, we saw what products were out there. We ended up demoing about 3 different products at the time. And then we also went to our clinical research staff who we knew had used e-regulatory binder systems as part of being an external or a participating site for a sponsored study. So who were familiar with some of these systems to get their feedback on how easy they were to use and did they see a benefit to us procuring one of those systems for our institute. So we sort of weighed the various pros and cons of all the different systems. And we ended up selecting one that sort of best suited our needs and that some of our staff were already familiar with. We felt that that would really help us with the implementation process, because we had a few people who could already kind of whisper in the other staff's ears to say, oh no, this system is awesome, I've used it before. So we thought that was sort of an advantage to choosing the one that we did choose. So the software that we chose is called FLORENCE. FLORENCE is an e-regulatory cloud-based software that allows staff to collect and manage their regulatory documents on a shared electronic platform. So I just want to note at this point that it's my understanding that FLORENCE offers other features, beyond just regulatory document management. However, due to some limiting factors, which I'll actually talk a little bit about at the end of my presentation, we at the Heart Institute have limited our use of Florence to just regulatory document management. So a little about Florence. It is a validated, backed up, and safeguarded system that offers the ability to implement risk-based and centralized monitoring. It is compatible with GCP requirements, and it is GDPR certified, which means that we can use it for our multi-center international studies, which is great. Some of our teams were very excited about that. So in terms of how we went about implementing Florence at the Heart Institute, we started by working closely with Florence to develop standardized binder templates, creating SOPs and guidance documents, and really fleshing out how we could use Florence at the Institute. And our office took on the role as institutional administrators for Florence. So we had to be the ones that really understood how the system worked inside and out, and understood how it would impact the study teams and how really we could use it to the best of its abilities. So for several months, we worked really closely with Florence to kind of figure out all of that before we launched it to our clinical research staff. We also were in touch with our IT department. So because it is a cloud-based software, there was no need for our IT department to have to install anything or calibrate anything or to really do any of that sort of thing. They just needed to make sure that there was going to be no obstacles to our staff using it. So for example, there was going to be no firewall blocks or anything like that that was going to prevent our staff from being able to use it. So after that, we went into our super user training. So again, at the Heart Institute, our office has decided that we wanted to have a very hands-on approach to using Florence, and that our office would be the super users, and that we would be the ones responsible for doing initial binder setup for all of our studies, and that we would be the one to grant all of the access to the system. But different institutions approach this in different ways. So our office got some very thorough training on the ins and outs of how to use the actual everyday functioning of Florence. And then we did our official launch of Florence to our staff with a training session. So Florence came to the Heart Institute. This is back when we could have big in-person meetings, and they did a big formal training session. And then after staff attended that training session, we granted them access to the system. So for staff who either weren't able to attend the training session or who started working at the Heart Institute after that training session, we do require them to complete a training before they are allowed to have access to the system. So that consists of a training video that we created ourselves. So it's a lot more custom to the Heart Institute than what Florence had sort of offered initially. And they're required to review our guidance documents and sign off to say that they understand how they are expected to use Florence at the Heart Institute. Sorry, excuse me. Had a sip of water, went down the wrong pipe. Okay. I'm so sorry. So at the Heart Institute, we use Florence primarily in two ways. So the first way is we use it as a central repository for all our training and credential documents, for all of our clinical research staff, for preventative maintenance records, for shared equipment, for lab licenses, reference intervals. We put our clinical research SOPs in there, commonly used templates, and our REB membership lists are all there. So essentially, it's all those documents that staff used to take a lot of time tracking down themselves. We now collect it. Our office collects it. We put it in this one centralized place, and we refer to it as our central repository. The second purpose or primary function that we use Florence for is for e-regulatory binder management for all of our internally sponsored investigator-initiated interventional studies. So other studies at the Heart Institute are permitted to use Florence. However, we don't mandate it for any of our OHRC sponsored or Heart Institute sponsored interventional studies. We actually require that they use Florence as their regulatory binder management system. So this is just sort of a snapshot of what our central repository looks like in Florence. So as I mentioned, it is managed by my office, and only we have the rights to upload and edit the contents of the documents that are in the central repository. So all of our internal staff users have access to read the files, and they can link all of the documents into their study binders. So there's a direct link that they can form from the central repository to their study binder. And then what happens is anytime I update a document in the central repository, anywhere where that document is linked, it automatically then updates those links as well. So if I update someone's CV, it's automatically going to update in all of the places where that CV is linked, which is very, very helpful. And then we also allow our staff the ability to download documents from our central repository. So if they have a study that's outside of Florence that they're managing, because it's not one of those ones that we mandate, if they're managing it in a different way, they can download any of the documents they need so that then they have a copy of that updated document for their essential document binders for that study. So by having the central repository, we've taken away the burden and redundancy from staff of having to chase down all these documents themselves. So then this is a sample of what one of our study binders would look like in Florence. So folders are set up similar to how they would be set up in a shared internal network drive. Files are easily uploaded and managed, allowing users to apply expiry dates, due dates, and you can do something called versioning in Florence. So what that means is if you upload a document and then there's a new version of that document, so if you have your protocol and then you have a new version of that protocol, you can actually upload the new version over top of the old version, so that when you click on the protocol, it's always going to come up with the most up-to-date version first. And then you have to toggle back to see old versions. So it's really helpful because it makes sure that staff are always using the most up-to-date version of all your important documents. And then in terms of access levels to a study binder, so this is very, very customizable in Florence. So for example, often we'll grant our coordinators and our investigators full access to the study binders so they can have full read and write access. They can delete documents, they can edit what's uploaded, whereas other staff or monitors, auditors, people like that, we would only give read-only access. And then finally, you can set up subfolders within a binder for different sites. And then you can have it so that your external site staff only have access to their site-specific folder. So they wouldn't be able to see the whole study binder, just the site-specific folder within your binder. So there's just various levels of access, and it's super, super easy to customize who can see what and who can do what. So in terms of other features and advantages of using Florence, so since Florence allows teams to manage most regulatory documents electronically, in an electronic study binder, it reduces the amount of paper storage required, thereby saving the Institute and the study team's money. This was extremely helpful during the pandemic because staff were asked to work from home. And so having this sort of shared electronic platform allowed for easy access to all of their study documents in one place. So as I mentioned, it has the ability to set expiry dates and due dates on documents to assist with compliance. So that's been huge for our office especially. So it helps teams keep track of when documents are due or when they will soon be expiring, so they know when they have to start chasing people down for updated documents. And then it helps our office because we can keep better track of when people's training and credentials are coming due, when we need to start chasing them for those updates. It's allowed our institute to develop standardized yet still customizable binder structures to ensure that all necessary documents are being included in the e-regulatory binders. So I had mentioned earlier, we sort of had like a basic template that we suggested people use when they were organizing their study binders. But now that it's all built into Florence, we're the office who sets up the binder structure. We make sure that they're not going to be missing any of the key documents that they need to have in their regulatory binders. We have the ability to set up and manage external site regulatory binders, allowing for easier oversight of their activities, plus no more having to physically mail out paper binders anymore, which is incredible. And it enables monitoring and auditing of studies, both internal and external. So again, this was extremely helpful during the pandemic. And just as a note, we actually did have a pre-inspection audit at one point during the pandemic, and Health Canada accepted Florence as one of the approved file sharing platforms for sharing documents with them. So that was something we were excited to hear, that Health Canada was on board with us using Florence for this purpose. And then finally, there is the ability to view audit trails, so which is a feature that makes it compliant with electronic document requirements. So in terms of the positive outcomes, so things that we've seen since that 2018 implementation, so our office has seen higher compliance with training requirements, because now we are able to track documents in our central repository and apply those expiry dates. It helps trigger us to follow up with staff and stay on top of them to make sure that all of their training is up to date. So we have a very high compliance rate of people having their training credentials up to date. Staff have noted that the central repository, which again is managed by our office, has saved them time from having to track down documents because we do all the chasing for them now. It's easier to set up regulatory binders for external sites. So again, no more having to print physical binders and mail them out, and to remotely monitor their activity. And it's also easier for external sponsors to monitor our site. So again, if anyone at the Heart Institute, if they have an externally sponsored study, they can still use Florence to manage their regulatory documents for those studies. And then we can grant access to those external sponsors, and they can monitor externally. And then finally, we have seen a decrease in the amount of paper records generated. However, I did want to note that having Florence does not completely eliminate the need, of course, for paper records. So in terms of the shortcomings, so sort of the things that Florence does not necessarily solve all of our problems. So first of all, it is a US-based cloud software. So I mentioned that earlier. And because of that, we have to ensure that no personal health information is uploaded to it. And the way that we ensure that no personal health information is uploaded to it is through thorough training of our staff. So we really make sure that we drive home that point with them. You cannot use this for anything that has personal health information on it. Second of all, there is a learning curve. There's a learning curve when you implement any new type of software. And some of our staff welcomed Florence with open arms. They were like, I can't believe we've taken this long to get something like this. This is life-changing. This is saving me so much time. Where others, would have preferred to stick to their old methods of managing their regulatory binders. I will say, though, I think we're at a point now where everyone is very comfortable with Florence. They understand the benefits of it, and they're completely on board with using it. But there's always that sort of transition period where you might get a little bit of resistance from some, and then you get others who are like huge cheerleaders and advocates for this type of system. There is an annual fee for using Florence, so you are committing yourself to continue to pay for use. I think this is the case with, any system that you find, or at least when we did our demoing, they all came with annual fees. So, you know, there is a cost associated that you really have to take into account. It is partially offset with the savings that you'll see in the reduced amount of paper storage, but again, it's still something that you have to keep in mind. And then finally, it does not replace the need for internal server storage. So I've had a few calls with different institutions who were thinking about, you know, using a regulatory system, and they asked like, oh, okay, this is going to relieve the burden of us having to have these documents on our internal server. And I had to break it to them, not really, because at the end of your study, you still need to download the entire contents of your e-regulatory binder, and you have to save it in long-term storage on your internal servers. At least that's the stance that we've taken on it, in order to make sure that you're compliant with keeping that those documents for that retention period, either 10 years or 15 years, whatever it is. You really need to have it on your own internal server. You need to have space for that. So sort of in conclusion, e-regulatory binders have improved compliance of staff training and have helped ensure proper management of essential study documents. They've saved staff time having to track down shared documents so they can focus on study conduct. They've reduced the amount of paper storage required for study documents, and they've enabled monitoring and auditing of regulatory documents and management of external site documents. So these are the sort of the biggest things that we've seen come out using this type of software. So that's my contact information. If anyone has any questions, obviously we'll take questions now, but if there's questions that you don't want to ask in an open forum and you just want to email me about, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And I'm happy to take questions now.